continue our investigation into Israel's legislative body. Now, let me give a recap of last week because I wasn't able to get as far into it as I had wanted to, just due to time last week. I was rather busy. So we saw that the Adah formed a legislative body within Israel. So you had the priest, which was a kind of a Supreme Court in some ways. He was the head authority that you would appeal to in judicial cases. Then you had the monarch or the leader, whether it be a judge or a more formal monarchy, such as what you had under David. And you find that these two branches, along with a legislative body that, believe it or not, appears to have had two parts to it, which is amazing when we see how in modern times that paradigm has served us well and has been an incredible blessing to us. So one of the first things that I want to look at tonight is the difference between the Adah and the Kahal, or the Kahal. And what we find in this is that they really kind of merge into one. You know, we don't have enough information to really know exactly how they were separated and where they divided, but there are some textual indications that indicate that they serve different purposes and that they are indeed recognized as a separate governing body. So let's look at a couple of these. Let's look at, let's see, I'm going to jump ahead. I'm actually going to jump around. I kind of debated which direction to take this, but let's go to, let's see. Let's go to Numbers 27, verse 1. And right now I'm on page 264. So this is when the daughters of Zelophehad came before Moshe and before Eleazar, the priest, and before the Nasi and the congregation, which is the Adah, by the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. So in this instance, we have Zelophehad's daughters who are appealing for a right. Not just a right, mind you. This is a constitutional right that they are lobbying Moses for. This is the constitutional right for women to inherit land when there is no male progeny. This is very, very key. And where does she make her appeal? Moses is there as the leader of the people. Aaron is there as the high priest, kind of the Supreme Court, the head of the Supreme Court. But then you have two groups. You have the Nasi as well as the Adah. And what we find is that these formed more or less, as I mentioned last week, kind of the Nasi were kind of a house of lords, whereas the Adah were a congregation of males. And we're going to see why it's males in just a minute. It wasn't necessarily to keep women subservient or anything like that. It really had to do with the way society functioned back 3,000 years ago. You know, and here's the other question. This was, I don't remember if I was asked the question here last week or if it was in another context. The question that I had was the Nasi, the elders of Israel, you know, at Mount Sinai, we are told that there was Moshe and there were 70 elders that appeared with him before Yahweh. So the question is, were there always 70 recognized elders throughout Israel's history? Was that like an unchanging number? Because we see that number occur again, especially within the traditions of the Septuagint and within later Jewish traditions. So I ask you to turn to Numbers 16:2. This is Numbers 16, verse 2. And this is the instance. I'm not going to read the verse, but let me just give you the background here. You can read it for yourself. This is where part of the congregation rebels against Moses and his authority. And, this is kind of like their own little small civil war, where part of the nation says, no, we're going to go our own way. Moses is taking on too much power for himself. We're going to do things our own way. So you had Abiram and Dathan, who are the instigators, the ringleaders of this coup. But guess who follows them? 250 of the Nasi follow them. these 250 basically almost legislators in some respects. I'm using that term very broadly, so please don't hold me to a very black and white definition here, because we really don't have one in the scriptural context. But we find that these leaders of the people were numbered far more than 70. There were 250. And the 250 are just the ones that followed the rebellers. There's a much larger portion that did not follow them and that remained faithful and that remained loyal to Moses and Aaron. So the idea of 70 is not exactly something that was an established number. It certainly was not constitutionally fixed. You know, in the United States Constitution, we do have provisions for the number of representatives. Like it originally began, I believe it was per 30,000, then per 50 or 60,000, and then they put a cap on it. It does not appear that Israel's representative body had a cap. Whatever the population was, it talks about captains of thousands, captains of 10,000. Those type of representatives still remained, and they were dual roles. As I talked about last week, today we think of clearly defined and clearly delineated branches of government where never the twain meet. You have your judiciary that does not form legislation, and they do not write legislation. In ancient Israel's time, we do have many instances where the Adah, which would have been more similar to the our House of Congress, where they actually judged as a jury in cases that merited the death penalty, say in murder trials or things such as that. So it is not as clear cut back then as what it is today. So just realize that even though we're talking about branches of government, even though we're talking about function, there was a lot of overlap. So just keep that in mind as we continue through the discussion. The other key, so the first key that we see that there's a difference is that when the daughters of Zelophehad come before Moses, there's two groups that are recognized as them appealing before them, both the Nasi as well as the Adah. The second indication that we're given that there were two separate bodies has to do with the heraldry. And, you know, so many times, I don't know about you guys, but reading through your scripture and you hear blow the trumpets for this, blow the trumpets for that, and you read over it, you're going, this is so boring. Why in the world do we need to have this recorded? Well, let me tell you, it is the heraldry that really helps us distinguish between some of these very nebulous concepts, whether it is between certain holy days or whether it is between this body. So this is what's fascinating. According to Numbers, and let me see if I can, this is going to be Numbers 10, verse 2. So we're working within the chapter 10. You find that the Nasi were called to the tabernacle because that's where they met and that's where they discussed issues and they judged on different matters, was before the congregation or before the tabernacle. And remember, this specifically refers to while they were in the wilderness. When they come into the land, this is going to be adapted to a more stable environment that focused around the temple and around the place where Yahweh had placed his name. So it's going to change a little bit. It's not always stagnant. And it is modified once they are in the land. But what you find is that when the Nasi are called, only one trumpet is blown. When the Adah and the Nasi are called together, two trumpets are blown. So that right there gives you a very clear distinction between the two groups. So we've seen twice that these groups of people are clearly distinguished, but yet they are always called to the tabernacle to discuss matters of state, to discuss domestic matters, to judge in court trials. So they have various functions, and they're also come to discuss military plans. So it's a very, very broad. And you know, this type of system where you can really have a lot of overlap works well when you are a small populace. As you grow into a burgeoning populace, you really have to have more clearly defined lines, and you have to have greater channels of hierarchy simply because it becomes too weighted down by the number of people that you have. So, but you see the precedent being established for all of these systems of government to work back 3,000 years ago at Mount Sinai. So now comes the question, what is the difference between the Adah and the Kahal? So let me give you the issue that's at stake here. Throughout, when you read the Old Testament, when you read the Tanakh, you will read that Moses called all the congregation of Israel together. And what your translation does not tell you, it doesn't matter if it's a Jewish translation, it doesn't matter if it's the KJV, the NIV, really doesn't matter what translation you're using. None of them tell you or reflect the fact that these are two different groups that are being called. They just use, for whether it's Adah or Kahal, they use a universal congregation translation for each of them. And the reason this matters is because the Adah referred specifically to males, landowning males within Israel society. So let me give you real quick the requirements for membership in the Adah. And this is going to, you will find this on page 267, 268, and 269 if you guys just want to look that up later. But the qualification for membership in the Adah, you had to be a landowner, you had to be a righteous, law-abiding citizen, you had to be circumcised, and you had to observe the holy days. Those are things that are specifically mentioned in the context of the Adah. So if you committed adultery, unlike our politicians today, you don't just hire a media blitz, do some social campaigning, and retain your seat. It is the fact that you are not capable of upholding moral integrity. And if you cannot uphold moral integrity in your own life, you're probably not going to have the strength, the stamina, and what is required to hold those up as far as matters of state and politics, where there is a whole lot more pressure and a whole lot more at stake. So if you've ever wondered why even modernly, and I'm trying to think of the guy, one of the latest guys that had to resign from office. He was a senator, I think, from Washington. His wife is Hillary Clinton's press secretary or chief assistant. The name will come to me in a little bit. I'm just, if you guys think of it, go ahead and type it in because I forgot her name. But if you ever wondered why men or women are exposed, politicians are exposed as having affairs, there's a lot of pressure on them to resign. That idea, that entire idea really stems from a Judeo, yes, thank you, Wiener. Wiener was the one that had to resign. Thank you so much, Jeff. So you find that this whole idea that a politician should resign for moral impairment is a Judeo-Christian value. You don't find that idea among any other cultures. But here's the importance of that. Having that accountability holds your integrity accountable, and it makes sure that you are truly working. You have the capacity to work in the best interest of your people. So again, the Kahal, or the Adah, and let me mention one other requirement of the Adah, and that was they also served in the military. So this would be akin to making every member of Congress, when they needed to, when we went to war, they had to spend a certain amount of time or a certain amount of the year in some sort of foreign campaign, if that is what they voted on doing, a mission they voted to engage in. So again, military, they were part of a military, a militia actually, land ownership, righteousness, circumcision, and observance of holy days. Now, what is the difference between the Adah and the Kahal? The Adah were those citizens. The Kahal was a much broader corpus. It encompassed women, children, and converts. Now, the reason converts were I'm going to use this very broadly. Don't take me out of context here. The reason converts were discriminated against as far as the Adah is concerned is that, well, actually, let me tell you what the Kahal did first. The Kahal came and they observed the holy days. They were especially commanded to come once every 7 years and observe. There really was no legislation that was put on them because several reasons. Number one, your ger, your convert, was not well versed in the law to really be able to offer a solid judgment based on the wisdom of Torah. Number one, you know, he had to have several years to learn and integrate into Israel's society and to fully understand the cultural values. And some of those cultural values came to play in administrative and domestic as well as foreign policy decisions. The other thing is that your immigrant, your ger that converted, he was not going to own land. So because he didn't own land, he could not vote in Israel's legislative assemblies. Now, if he gained land 3 generations later, his children, as we will see in a moment, would have the ability to vote. So it wasn't a forever ban. It was simply a 3-generational ban, which we will see as we proceed. So the Kahal was all citizens, women, children, converts. They came, they celebrated at the temple. They were very much an integral part of Israel's society. It's just that it was recognized that they had other responsibilities and that the affairs of state would not be laid on them. It would not be a burden to them. You know, today our ideas of the affairs of state have changed, where we do not necessarily see it as a burden. But there is a great deal of evidence that we have in Torah and anciently that the affairs of state were considered burdensome. They were considered something that was not wanted among the people. For instance, you have Yahweh at the Exodus saying, I have taken the Levites for service out of all the rest of you, and only they shall have, you know, the servitude. And the idea there is that they bear a lot of the administrative functions that even governments today have, whether it's records, administration of land ownership, the buying and selling of slaves, a lot of those administrative functions, whether it be the selling actually even of grain, whether it be the grain to the temple or the temple's ability to procure grain and then distribute it among its citizens or sell it among its citizens. All of those were responsibilities that would have fallen under the jurisdiction of the priesthood. So you find that there is a distinction, and the Kahal is very, very broad. You also find, and let me give you an example. I mentioned earlier how the Adah actually judged in court cases. If you look at Leviticus 24, verses 14 through 16, and again in Numbers 35, 15 through 36, you'll find a situation that is given, an example of the Adah actually judging in a court case and rendering a death penalty. So, and here's the key too, if they rendered the death penalty, the members of their congregation, whether it was by lot, we don't know, but at least a certain number of members of that Adah body assembly were required to actually implement that death penalty. So they couldn't just do it and pass the buck to somebody else. They actually had to carry it through. So you find also that we mentioned that there was one point of heraldry for the Nasi when the princes came, another form of heraldry for the Adah when the Adah and the Nasi came, but you have a third type of heraldry that is used for the Kahal. So with the Kahal, it is you shall blow but not sound an alarm. So you have 3 different types of heraldry for 3 different bodies or congregations of people within Israel's ancient society. So that I find is very strong evidence of this kind of hierarchy of how Israel's society was functioned, as well as how it was divided and delineated. The other thing that you find is that even though people were segregated, say, along these ideas of legislature or the ability to function within a legislature, it did not separate them, or they were not considered a lesser class by any means. And in fact, you have Isaiah who says that they are one and the same. You know, don't discriminate against them, accept them. And we're going to look at that in just a minute. The other thing that you find, and you know, this is, if we look at the days of Ezra and Nehemiah, we find that the word adopt, you know, and I don't know how many of you saw the teaching that I did last week on how to study Torah. One of the things that I mentioned is that over time, certain words will sometimes fall out of use. Like the word today, thee and thou and thither and 10. All of those words have fallen out of use and they've been replaced by other words. Let me take a drink. You find that by the time we get to Ezra and Nehemiah, the term adah has really fallen out of use, and it is in their works, it is only represented by the word kahal. And the kahal really comes to represent Israel's elders, their legislative body, and it was a decision-making body to some extent, whether that is to be associated with the Knesset, the great congregation or not. You know, it's debatable, but it is definitely, you don't even have a reference to the Adah in any Second Temple literature. So we find that the term does indeed become replaced, and the two terms morph together by the time we reach the Second Temple era. We also find, let me look at my notes here, I don't want to get too far off track. We find that the interesting thing for the requirement in the Adah for land ownership meant that the Levites could not vote in the Adah. So the Levites, hold on, my phone is ringing here. Okay, I'm going to have, hold on just a minute. Ariel, that's Charlie's mom. Thank you. So the requirement for land ownership and the Adah meant that the Levites could not participate. They could not be part of that legislative body because they did represent another group within Israel's society. So if you worked for the government, you're not going to be able to vote in the People's Assembly. It was considered a balance of power. The other thing that we find is that this idea that only the righteous were eligible, righteous law-abiding citizens. You know, the word karat, which means cut off, has a connotation very much tied to covenant. So that the idea of a covenant itself is that you are cutting a covenant. Even within the last 50 years, we would refer to the idea of cutting a deal. And that terminology has survived us for 3,000 years. For it to last that long, it had to be such an integral concept within Israel's society, within Israel's community, and not just Israel, but all ancient nations, for that concept to be so entrenched with the idea of cutting a covenant. So Israel's ancient covenants were so important, and you had cut this covenant with God. The whole nation had at Sinai, and again in the plains of Moab and Deuteronomy, and this covenant is inherited perpetually, everlasting covenant through all generations. So it doesn't matter 1,000, 2,000 generations down the road, this covenant, this constitutional covenant, is still in effect. But we have this idea in Torah that there were some things you could do that cut you off from the covenant. So if you did certain things, you were no longer part of that covenant. You were no longer covered by that covenant. So in the terminology and the way that the term is used throughout Scripture is really kind of nebulous. Sometimes you get the idea of excommunication. Sometimes you get the idea of death. And sometimes you just get the idea that you're cut off from a legislative assembly. So let me give you some examples of things that merited being cut off. And hold on just a minute. My neighbor called for her son. Just a moment. Did you send Charlie home? Is Ethan taking him home? Okay, thank you. So you find this idea that if a person, a citizen, and really didn't matter if it was a citizen or a convert, it's really universal. You find that if they did not observe the Passover and the days of unleavened bread, they were cut off from Israel. If they remained unclean and they did not take the steps to remedy their uncleanness, they were cut off from the congregation of Israel. If they were not circumcised, they were cut off from the congregation of Israel. Now, the importance of circumcision, if you guys will remember, is that one of the very first Abrahamic covenants stated that you had to be circumcised in order to be recognized as part of the children of Israel. And in Genesis 17:14, Yahweh goes so far as to say that if you are not circumcised, you will not be recognized as one of Abraham's legitimate heirs. And it even says that he will be cut off from this righteous congregation. The other thing that you find is that if the person had committed homosexuality or incest, if he compounded the holy anointed oil, if he sacrificed his child to Molech, if he did not afflict himself on the Day of Atonement, or if he worked on the Shabbat. All of these things were actions, violations of the covenant that you could do that caused you to be cut off from the covenant. So what exactly were you cut off from? From what I see and from what everything in the text seems to indicate is that you were cut off from being a part of the blessing. Now, remember previously, if you go back to a couple of chapters when we were discussing the difference between the birthright and blessing. The blessing is specifically the form of government that Yahweh has established, whereby Jacob's children establish liberty in the earth, a constitutionally defined liberty. So, but to be a part of that blessing, you have to be obedient. So if you are not obedient, then you are cut off from participation. That means you're cut off from participating in the legislative assemblies. So you lose your right to vote, because the Kahal would have had some voting rights. You lose your right to vote, but you especially lose your right to vote in the legislature. So if you've done any of these things, you cannot be a representative for your tribe, your clan, your family. It is not permissible. So that was a protection that God gave for the nation to keep everything, to keep everyone accountable, and to make sure that people had the wisdom and the integrity to judge in the right matter, in favor of righteous causes, and not just be overly pretentious in one way, or to have too much pity and leniency in the other way. So this brings us to the idea. Oh, and let me just give you some verses real quick before we move on. Some ideas of being cut off. You can find that in Exodus 12:19, as well as in Numbers 19:20. And you find that the idea of being cut off from the legislative body or from the congregation, the lay congregation, it didn't matter if you were a native-born citizen or if you were a convert citizen. It was the same law. There was one law, so one law unilaterally applied to all citizens. So there we find that in Torah, and let's look at Deuteronomy 23:1, because really Deuteronomy 23, the entire purpose of that chapter is to define who is eligible for participation in the legislature as well as in the lay kahal. And you find that one of the people, the groups of people that are banned from participation is the eunuch, those that have lost their appendage, or those that are wounded in the stones, as it's written in the KJV. You find that these people are banned. And it's the idea there is that a eunuch who is usually has loyalty to some person other than himself. So if he's allowed to vote, his vote can be manipulated by his master, number one. Number two, banning the eunuch makes the practice of castration very unpopular because that person loses his rights as a citizen. He just doesn't, he's not able to have a stake in Israel's future. His vote would not look years down the road because he had no stake in the future, because he had no children that could inherit his land, his property, or any of that. So it was really something that was to discourage that whole entire class within society. But Isaiah is very, very careful. He's very adamant that even though a person may have been a eunuch, it did not preclude them from participating in the lay congregation. And this is what Isaiah says. He says, let me find my text here because I have lost it here. Okay. And I am jumping around if you guys are following along in the book. So let me find it here. So I wanted to read. Okay. So this is Isaiah 56:3-5. It says, neither let the son of the stranger, the Nakar, and then we get again, a Nakar is an unconverted Israelite, somebody who has no desire to convert. He is a foreigner. So neither let the son of the stranger that has joined himself to Yahweh. So once he's joined himself to Yahweh, he's no longer a Nakar. He is now a Ger. He is a converted Israelite, and he now has a recognition of citizenship within Israel's society. So he is now a citizen. So the stranger that's joined himself to Yahweh, saying, Yahweh has utterly separated me from his people. Neither let the eunuch say, behold, I am a dry tree. For thus saith Yahweh, to the eunuchs that keep my Sabbath and choose the things that I please and take hold of my covenant, even to them will I give in my house and within my walls a place and a name better than sons and daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that shall not be cut off. So notice here the idea of cutting off again is the idea that you may not be able to have children, but you will be able to have a fame, a name, and a recognition. A great example of this would be a eunuch such as Daniel, who indeed had a great fame, name, and recognition that has lasted unto our day today. So, he may not have been able to have children, but he did have some sort of inheritance and some sort of legacy. Now, we've seen the qualifications for participating in the Adah and the Kahal within Israel. How do these qualifications apply to the foreigners, to the Gers that join themselves to Israel, that take hold of the covenant to obey it? How are they integrated into Israel's legislative body? In the United States, you take a course, a citizenship course, to get first you get your visa, and then you get your green card, and then you apply for your citizenship, and eventually you become a citizen of the United States of America. As soon as you are a citizen, you gain access. You can vote in all elections. You can vote. There's no further requirement to integrate into the American culture. There's no requirement to walk like the Egyptians or anything like that. You can really maintain a separate identity, a separate ethnicity within American society. You find that Yahweh, in his infinite wisdom, had some provisions that protected Israel's citizens from foreigners that would come in, get strong. That one of the curses of the law says, the stranger that is among you will get high above you, and you will get very low if you do not follow all the commands I set before you this day. So you find that one of the commands that Yahweh gave had to do with membership in both the Kahal and the Adah, as far as converts from either allied nations, nations that were peaceful with Israel, or nations that were hostile to Israel. So what I want to do first is look at the hostile nations. And if you look at page 270, this is where Deuteronomy sets down a precedent, sets down a statute whereby protecting Israel's congregation. And let's read this. This is Deuteronomy 23, verses 3 through 6. It says, an Ammonite or a Moabite shall not enter into the congregation of YHWH, even to their 10th generation. I mean, this is quite a long time. Shall they not enter into the congregation of YHWH forever, because they met you not with bread and with water when you came forth out of the land of Egypt, and because they hired against you Balaam the son of Beor, of Pethor of Mesopotamia, to curse you. Nevertheless, Yahweh your God would not listen to Balaam, but Yahweh your God turned the curse into a blessing to you. Because Yahweh your God loved you, you shall not seek their peace or their prosperity forever. So this is key. This is very key because of the fact that Yahweh puts this 10 generational ban. And we can think of this as being harsh, as being excessive. And remember, the only thing that this was a ban for was for the Adah. It did not ban them for the Kahal. All Gers, all converts were readily accepted into the Kahal, but they could not vote in the Legislative Assembly. And I see we have someone here. Justin, you're more than welcome to be here, but if I see spam, I am going to bounce you from the room. So just a warning, because I'm not quite sure of your intentions. So if you want to listen and participate, ask questions, that's fine. So you find that why were the Ammonites and the Moabites banned? You find that for over 1,500 years, well over 1,500 years, the Ammonites and Moabites had this utter hatred of Israel. Very similar to what we see the Palestinians today, where it doesn't matter the health care that is afforded to them. It doesn't matter the generosity, the open hand. It does not matter what is extended to these people. This hatred is so part of their culture, and it is so part of their psyche that they will do anything to subvert and to kill Israel's citizens, including feigning conversion, feigning allegiance to Israel's God and obedience and all of these things. And the greatest example that we have of this is the example of Tobiah the Ammonite, who the Second Temple remnant totally violated and ignored Yahweh's covenant. And they allowed Sanballat to have a voice in Israel's Kahal, in their congregation. And not only that, they also allowed a lot of the tithes, the taxes, the income taxes that were collected among the Jews in the Second Temple era to be collected. And part of that was not even used to support Israel's own government. It was given to Tobias and Sanballat. So these two people, these two foreigners who had open hostility to Israel's people, for them even being in the land, the priests and the Levites willingly give these enemies to Israel voice in their legislative assemblies. They give them voice in the way and the function of state and the policies that they embrace. And they did it to their detriment, because Judea never prospered. Judea never became anything that was independent or significant. And what it had under the Maccabees was not all that great either, as we'll see when we get into chapters 15 and 16. So all of this came because they did not follow Torah. So again, you find that the ban, the 10 generation ban, is there because you might can make a conspiracy for 3 or 4 generations, seek to integrate into society, seek to have a name, a recognition, um, be able to sway voters for a few generations, but 10 generation equals about 250 years. Within 250 years, it's going to be very difficult to keep that that conspiracy alive. There's going to be a lot of pressure to integrate. You're going to want to vote in this society. Your children may not inherit that hate. Eventually, it will be weeded out. I mean, you may marry an Israelite, so you're going to think like an Israelite. You're going to adopt the culture. You're going to view yourself as an Israelite. So you're no longer a Ger. You're no longer a foreigner. You're no longer an Ammonite. But God understood this was a process that was not always completed in one generation. And for those that had hostilities, it was 10 generations. Now, that was not the same if you came from an allied nation. If you came from a nation that was at peace with Israel, say a nation such as Egypt or Edom that were considered a brotherhood, there was only a ban of 3 generations. God saw that within 3 generations, you would adopt Israel's culture. This is the key too that I find interesting, is that when you study Egyptian law, there was a lot of similarity in the Egyptian culture and the laws that Egypt taught, as well as Torah. So there would have been a lot of cogency where it is supposed, because I really haven't gotten into this a whole lot, but whereas the Ammonite and the Moabite law codes would have greatly departed from the Torah. They didn't really have that base to start off with, that base in their own culture. So Edom and Egypt did have a base of a righteous standard, an idea of justice and judgment, although the Torah clarified that and distinguished it within Israel's society. There was still a capacity, a cultural capacity to understand that. But within 3 generations, the children of that Ger that converted could vote in the Adah, and they had voting rights within the assembly. So, Isaiah continues this idea of the Ger as well as the eunuch being able to participate in the Kahal. And if you look at Isaiah 55, verses 6 and 7, Isaiah says, also the sons of the stranger, which again is a Nakar, that join themselves to love and serve Yahweh, that to keep his name, to be his servants, everyone that keeps my Sabbath from polluting it, and takes hold of my covenant, even them will I bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices shall be accepted on my altar, for my house shall be called a house of prayer to all people. So you find that whether it was a eunuch or whether it was a convert, their sacrifices, their offerings, their ability to have a relationship with God, their ability to participate in Israel's ceremonial aspects of the law and of their religion, there was no impediment. There was no barrier to that. It simply had to do with the legislative process and embracing those policies that would make the nation strong. So the last group of people that we find there are, frozen up. Let's see if it comes back. Okay. Everything looks fine here on my end. So I'm just going to continue going because I think I'm still recording. I don't see anything anything that's frozen here. I'm just, Alejandra, maybe try refreshing. Okay. So let me go back here. Hope I don't click the wrong tab. So the last group are going to be the mamzeers and the terminally contagious. I'm getting dried out, so I'm going to turn this off. I have a little heater that's really dried me out. Now, let me just state that the mamzer, the term mamzer, is really one of the most contested translations throughout the Tanakh. Mamzer is traditionally understood to mean an illegitimate child. This is contentious because some scholars say that the term is so limited that we can't really know for sure that it indeed means an illegitimate child. The tradition has come down that that's what it means. That is what most of your lexicons assign the meaning as. But let me just, before we go into the topic, let me just leave it open that there is a possibility that it could refer to another classification or group of people. But for purposes of argument, I did go with the traditional interpretation, which is that it is an illegitimate child. And the reason that I saw there being validity to this interpretation is the two factors. Number one, mamzeers, an illegitimate child, would not have inherited tribal lands. If he did not own tribal lands, he could, that was one of the basic foundations of voting rights in the Adah, was owning tribal land. So if his father did not recognize him and he was illegitimate, he would not have that voting right naturally by default. This just kind of clarifies that distinction and makes it stronger. Secondly, you find that a lot of times people from illegitimate relationships have lesser moral values. Not always, but you look at throughout our society, and you find that people that cohabitate, people that the children in those relationships don't always have the highest standard of morality. So this again protected Israel's culture, Israel's society from being swayed by a voice that took them away from the wisdom and the judgments of the statutes Yahweh had given to them. You also find that mamzeers were more likely to grow up in poverty. They didn't have a tribal heritage. They either grew up on their father's land, I'm sorry, not their father's, their grandfather's land, their maternal grandfather's land, or they were sold into slavery, or they lived in the city and did not have that tribal access. So all of those things together prevented him from being able to have some of the moral moorings that made him have, or allowed him to grow up with the wisdom and the understanding that the Torah afforded. And, you know, I think even more importantly is that son's relationship with his father. Sons who don't have that healthy relationship often are very rebellious. They have a lot of hatred. They have a lot of unsettled issues. And to bring those issues into a legislative context would be to disturb the harmony and the peace within that legislative body, and really interject issues that should be totally non-issues where the state and the government is concerned. The other ban that we see is on the terminally contagious, where there is, you know, back then they didn't have antibiotics. Leprosy in most verses is referred to, or rather the I believe the Hebrew there is Tutsa Artha. Stephen, am I pronouncing that right? But Tutsa Artha is the term, a generic term that is usually translated leprosy. Now, leprosy, the Hebrew term, when you go through all the manifestations of that term, it was a broad gamut of skin diseases. It wasn't just Hansen's disease, which is modern leprosy, or one specific disease. It was really a whole host of diseases. But if you had a contagious disease, you were not only barred from the Adah, you were also barred from the Kahal. You could not even bring your sacrifices to the temple. And the reason for this injunction was to protect Israel's congregation. Again, they did not have antibiotics. They did not have steroids. They did not have all the medications that we have today that in some cases cure disease or prevented. So what this prevented was a person coming with either a bacteria or a virus coming to a community gathering place, spreading germs, spreading bacteria, virus, coming in contact with other people and infecting other people. It was an idea of quarantine, an idea of protecting the larger congregation within Israel. So it was something that was merciful to the majority, even though it put stipulations on the individual. And the idea, okay, thank you, Stephen. Zarath. Okay, Zarat. Okay, thank you very much. So you find that all of these things that are there are to make the body, the corpus, and the federation of Israel this incredibly wise and understanding nation, a nation that is strong economically, a nation that is strong militarily, a nation that is strong as far as liberty. You know, look at how the liberty within the United States has made us such a strong nation. And we're unified. We have such incredible patriotism and love for our nation because of the liberty it affords us. And we look at all the nations around us and we see how they don't even come close to what we enjoy. You know, some of the lowest taxes, some of the greatest freedom to move about, the ability to choose your own life, your own profession. All of these things Israel would have seen and would have been able to compare with this with other nations, and it would have fostered that love and liberty of the law because of the strong precedents and statutes that it established for the nation's citizenry. So this concludes this chapter. Let me go ahead and give y'all the portion for next week. I think we're just going to go to page 281. We'll see how it goes. We're either going to go to 281. Yeah, we are. We're going to stop at page 281 next time. So at this point in time, I'm going to go ahead and open it up for general discussion. Any questions or comments? It's great to see everyone here. And please do ask lots of questions, because there's lots of, you know, particular things. I mean, most people just see this as when they look at the bans on the Moabite and the Ammonite, they look at it as a racial ban. You know, God was a racist, or he preferred one group of people, he's discriminating, without looking at the political implications. When you look at those political implications, it really bears an entirely different light that actually makes the Torah make sense and have a very relevant context as far as being very wise and a way of life that definitely works. Can you imagine what would happen here in the United States if immigrants from Syria, from Lebanon, people that are wanting Sharia, if these are people that have a known had a very known hatred for the United States, if it was 10 generations before they could vote, it's really going to change a whole lot. I mean, it's going to change the entire political dynamics. So Raylene says, understand now why Esau sold his birthright. It was so serious. Yeah, it really was. You know, the birthright was the possession of land, and not just land, but the double portion of land. That land, it gave the capacity to enjoy and inherit the blessing, because you cannot have a blessing, which is a constitutionally defined government, without the land on which to live on. So they really go hand in hand. They're just two aspects of the overall Abrahamic blessing. Betty says, if the son was recognized by his father, but the father was not married to the mother, did it make any difference? You know, I think as long as the father recognized the son, I think that is all that was required. Back then, we have some instances where they didn't always have formal marriage ceremonies the way that we have today. Sometimes it was a written contract. Sometimes the wife was a servant, a slave, like a concubine. So the only thing that seems to have mattered was that the father recognized that child. Now, if a marriage was already in place, there was a natural recognition, simply because there already would have been that union, that contact, and that relationship would have been acknowledged legally. Hold on just a minute. My neighbor's mother is here to pick him up. Charlie? Ariel, can you go get Charlie? His mom is here. So, yeah, that was one of the differences. So, any other questions? I mean, this to me, this is where Torah just totally comes to life. And you just see, you know, I think I say this every week, I just fall in love with the Torah over and over again, because you see its wisdom and its understanding. Okay, so Sylvia asks, can you explain what the Great Assembly was? And the Great Assembly, I know the term is the Knesset Gadol. When you don't work with it on a day-to-day basis, some of the terms become kind of murky and faded. But the Great Assembly was the governing body during the Second Temple period that formed a lot of new statutes and new regulations for the Torah. Ezra talks about them, as well as does Nehemiah in his book, and we'll see this as we get into chapters 18 and 19. They address this Great Assembly, but you find that this assembly dropped some of the regulations in Torah, but their number one achievement was to put a guard and a hedge around Torah. And that guard and that hedge is generally recognized even today, especially among Judaism. So we'll discuss the Great Assembly even in more depth. They were elders in Israel. There is a tradition that there were 70 elders, but a lot of people there are traditions that hold Ezra as the leader of that assembly. I do challenge that assumption as we get into chapters 18 and 19, because I do not see the text supporting that. But that is basically what the Great Assembly was. The Great Assembly did not exist during the monarchy years. What you have during the years of the monarchy is the Adah, and it is the Adah that you find conspire with the priesthood to overthrow Judah's kings when those kings overstep their constitutional authority, whether it's Uzziah or Azariah. When they overstep those bounds, there's this conspiracy whereby they hold the king accountable. So that is something that preserved the integrity and the liberty of Israel's citizens, and didn't just give the monarch a free pass whereby he could just abuse his power. So any other questions or comments? So I always love the Friday night classes. Okay, Keith says, this is what happens when Torah is not followed. Ephraim is half-baked cake. Strangers have devoured his strength. Absolutely. That is a great point, Keith. We do become devoured because everything in Torah makes us strong. It makes us a mighty and undefeatable people. The only way that the stranger gets among us, the only way we are overcome, is by ourselves. We are our own worst enemies. So when we decline from the Constitution, it weakens us and makes us an easy prey. And the other reason, I think this is really important to understand, the other reason we become an easy prey is that other nations around us, I don't care if it's anciently or modernly, other nations around us look at our liberty. They see our economic prosperity and they are jealous. They want what we want without doing what we have to do to achieve it. So rather than saying, oh, this Constitution works well, let's try it. No, they just want to get rid of, or they want to make martyrs out of the people that follow it. So the moment we decline, there's this open animosity towards it that is ready to come in and devour. So it becomes utterly important that we live by it, that we sanctify it in every way, and that we establish it for our children and for their generations, and just teach them how important it is. So I guess if there's something you take away tonight, go teach your kids how important the Constitution is, the Torah Constitution, as well as the American Constitution. Instill that love in them and show how good it is for them. So if any other questions, if not, I'm just going to go ahead and say this. If you guys do have a question, please post it. But I hope to see you guys tomorrow morning at Roots of Faith. Ross is continuing his Messiah series. So please invite all your friends and family to come and join, because he is doing part 2 on the Messiah. A lot of interesting concepts that he's going to be going through. So, all right. Well, if there's nothing else, I hope you guys stay warm, stay safe, and we will see you tomorrow. Shabbat Shalom.